right, hello everyone. Wow, this is such a fantastic audience. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Erica Berry and Caroline Hagood with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Erica's debut book, Wolfish. But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while at this event. If you need an extra one, we've got some up at the front where you checked in. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's conversation, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Erica will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Wolfish online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. In Wolfish, we find an incredible blend of science, history, personal narrative, and cultural criticism. It has been hailed as wise and arresting, exhilarating and triumphant. And really, there is just so much to explore in this book, so needless to say, we cannot wait to hear what more Erica has to say about it tonight. Erica Berry is a writer based in her hometown of Portland, Oregon. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, the New York Times Magazine, the Yale Review, Catapult, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. A former writer in residence with the National Writers Series in Traverse City, Michigan, she is currently a writer in the Schools with Literary Arts in Portland. Wolfish is her first book. And as I mentioned earlier, Caroline Hagood joins Erica in conversation tonight. Caroline is an assistant professor of literature, writing and publishing, and director of undergraduate writing at St. Francis College in Brooklyn. She is the author of 2 poetry books, the novel Ghosts of America, and the book-length essays, that is weirdly hard to say, Ways of Looking at a Woman and Weird Girls Writing the Art Monster. Her novel Filthy Creation is forthcoming this May. All right, that's all for me. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Erica and Caroline.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to start with the reading. We'll just dive right in. This is such a gift to be here and to be with all of you. So thank you for sharing your evening with us. This is from a chapter called Girl versus Wolf. It's the second chapter in the book. And I'm starting in the middle. A few weeks into my first semester, I left the college library around 11 p.m. to walk to my dorm. The quad of the Snow Globe campus was quiet, and the air smelled like pine trees and old rain, and my mind was full of Robert Haas, the California poet whose words I'd been introduced to in class that week. His poems were full of droopy trees and fog-soaked mornings, and I was surprised how swiftly my longing for Oregon had gotten caught between his words, gathering like lint in a comb. The nostalgia flustered me, revealing a homesickness I'd so far kept tamped down. That was what I was thinking as I kicked my sneakers through the moonlit grass, how sorely I wanted a sign that I belonged here in a dining hall of lacrosse sticks and pastel shorts embroidered with tiny lobsters. A place where people referred to the city and only meant one place, New York, even though many took planes to arrive, passing over other cities as they went. It's fun to read that line in New York. As I rounded the curve of a shadowy path about 200 yards from my front door, I saw a pack of guys walking toward me through the trees. I do not know whether to call them men or boys. I could not tell if they were talking, but they had the straight gait of people who were not engaged in conversation, but purpose. Their bodies were muscular, solid as a wall of trees. We are what we can imagine, wrote Haas in the poem Winged and Acid Dark. Some spark plug in the root of my spine told me to panic, but I was what my parents called jumpy, and I was trying to learn to control it. Besides, this was a small town of students and retirees on the coast, and I was used to seeing others returning from the library at this hour. I imagined the group would murmur hello as we slouched past each other. They did not. When we were a few feet apart, the line of guys formed a tight semicircle around me. They did not speak, but they stared, and when I looked back, I saw their faces were masked in white cotton t-shirts with slits for eyes and mouth. The white athletic socks they wore on their hands turned their fingers into paws. I do not need to tell you what my heart did in those moments, or for the rest of the night, or for the nights that followed, but what happened to my body is that it froze. The men were frozen too. It was a terrible dance. The moon gaped above us. Pray, I thought, with an A, also pray with an E. Nobody talked. I waited for their hands to reach for me. They did not. Finally, my body pushed through their bodies and ran, and nobody followed. Within minutes of arriving back to my dorm, I called campus security and reported the masked men. The next day, an officer called me to confirm their identity on camera footage. Their headquarters was behind the little white house where I just attended my first student newspaper meeting, and I kept my head low as I walked down the driveway, trying not to feel like a snitch. I didn't know if the masked men were a legitimate threat, but I trusted security would solve the problem. Now, sitting on the edge of a plastic office chair, I watched a stream of silent video that showed the men keying into one of the dorms, jostling one another in the foyer like herded cows. That's them, I said. The officer, one I didn't know, ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. Creepy as heck with their faces and hands covered like that. I nodded. What else was there to say? These were the faces I would think of years later when reading about the ancient warrior men who, when masqueraded as animals, did things they would never do as men. The officer told me these were first-year soccer players who'd been initiated. That is code for drunk. Hazed. Security staff had already spoken with the guys. They were very sorry about their inebriated prank. They meant no harm, he said. That did not make me feel safer, but it did make me feel foolish, like I should have been in on the joke. When he mentioned some names, I recognized one as someone who sat behind me in microeconomics, a guy who had already smiled and retrieved a pencil I dropped on the floor. He wore the sweatshirt of his boarding school and had the blunt, forgettable attractiveness of a Ken doll. Then the officer told me the soccer players did not know whom they had scared, but they wanted to apologize face to face. I thought about it. I wanted to see how the men were sorry on their lips. But some shard of my teenage self did not want to interfere with the equilibrium of that afternoon economics class or anything else. I said I didn't need a personal apology. On one level, it seemed only fair. They had had their masks, and now I could have mine. I wanted to let them think I could be any woman on campus, that I could be anywhere watching them, that at any moment I might step toward them, collapse the space, and open my mouth, that the hunted could play hunter. Mostly, though, I did not want to be known for my tattletale fear. At some point after leaving security, I got a call from a campus dean who apologized for what had happened and mandated I see a campus mental health counselor. I began to wonder if, in the college's eyes, it was I and not the boys who needed fixing. Later that day, I called my mother. We were close, so I told her almost everything. But with a country of new distance between us, I wanted to frame things in a way that wouldn't worry her. I mentioned what had happened with the soccer players, but I spent more time making an anecdote of my visit to security, with its burnt coffee smell and its wall of little screens. She laughed when I laughed and then apologized. "I'm so sorry that happened," she said. We both knew that what this really meant was, "I wish I could protect you from everything." We were silent for a second, then I said, "It's okay," which we both knew meant, "I know you can't." Evenings were different after that night. Even once I learned the group had meant no harm, I called the campus shuttle to ride a few blocks, or I left the library whenever a friend left, or I just did homework in my dorm. Logically, I understood that nothing about the state of campus safety had changed. The only thing that had changed was my capacity to understand life at the brink of terror. That, it seems, was enough. It was a waiting room I dreaded returning to. Every day men did far worse things than the soccer players had done to me. I had been, for so many years, luckier than so many, but that night on the quad was the first brick to smash the glass, shattering the window between my lived experiences and my anxieties of what the world could hold. It was the first time I accepted that the stranger coming toward me down the street might not just nod or ignore me, that he might be wearing a mask when he blocked my path. It was, in this way, a night for growing up. I cannot remember what happened to the soccer players or if they received any punishment, and I am not sure what the charges would have been because I am still not sure how to narrate the night. The word victim has its roots in the Latin victima, meaning sacrificial animal. Could I be a victim if the boys had not meant harm? I did not feel like one, not exactly. I felt like a girl who had left home and learned a lesson. I had this in common with the boys. They who had just left home too, they who, like me, were learning their thresholds, what we could get away with, what could break us. As the months passed, I wondered if that night stood out for them at all. In the college's eyes, they were just sheep in wolves' clothing. Thank you.
Okay. So now you've had a little taste of this book, which, but from the size of it, as you can see, it is just such a small piece of what she's accomplished here. So my first question, I'm actually going to go in different order based on your reading. We've chatted a little bit about this. But I think my first question is, so at a certain point, and I can't remember if it's in the book or in an interview, you talk about this moment where you know, you had it was a writing professor or it was a mentor, it was somebody who said, you know, you can either write a book about wolves or a book about, you know, being a woman in the world and the sense of fear and this sort of cultural piece, this other cultural piece. And what I love about you, although I'm just meeting you in person today, but once you, when you read this book and when you're with it, you will feel like you do know her quite well. But of course, that's one of the magic of books. But you were like, no, I am going to write both of these books together. So talk to me about that sort of little act of rebellion that leads to sort of a deeper and more complex book, and how you had and really it could be a scary path, right? But you were brave in that sense. And how did you make that decision? No, I'm going to do these books together.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm calling it now. I have a craft term for this, and it's the spite right, which is really, really generative and productive. And
I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. I really endorse it. It's better than the supportive feedback. This was during so I started this project. I started researching wolves as an undergraduate, and I was studying them academically and journalistically, and I thought of myself as sort of like a New Yorker narrative journalist that was like reporting on wolf repopulation in Oregon. And at some point in the next 5 years of my early 20s, my life became swamped with fear. And I don't think I totally realized at the time that that's what was going on, but I was hypervigilant to a degree that I now know was not my baseline. Like something specific was going on, and I'd had a few experiences with moments that what I thought was going on had been hijacked, right? And some of it was actually reporting this book. Like, it's quite interesting. Like, you're like, I'm just here being a reporter. I'm taking a train to do my little reporting, and then I had a kind of stalker on the train that I write about in the first chapter that became the whole pie chart of my brain, right? And it became, I thought, are all the other nonfiction writers just a lot better at hiding their embodied experiences of reporting than I am? And I think about Rachel Kadzigonza's wonderful Pulitzer-winning piece about Dylan Roof's family, where she writes about sometimes your body is not just the observer, you're the observed. And I think I was spending time trying to report on wolves in one way and also thinking about the sort of like very real DNA of these wolf stories, like Little Red Riding Hood, in another way. And, you know, I think so many of us who are writers, like you have the story you think you should write because it's like important with a capital I, and then you have the story that your body just does. And I was trying to figure out how everyone else was doing a better job of living beside their mortality, potential violence, like all of these things that I was struggling with. So I tried to do this for my MFA thesis, and my one of the advisors was like, "You haven't done this. It's not 2 books." And I think that was where the engine of spite just like really fueled up, and she was a wonderful advisor in any ways. I don't mean to demean the feedback, except that like I just knew she was wrong about that one detail. And it became my mission to figure out how to like knit these things together. And I do think they are knit together. I mean, I had an experience very early on reporting in a bar. Well, we were actually, one of my friends who was in this scene with me is in this room, so she can fact check it later. We were in a bar in Eastern Oregon, and we were just like, my goal was like, I don't want to tell people that I'm reporting on wolves because it's quite controversial. But it came out that that's what we were doing, and a guy came over to us and was quite aggressive and sort of.
That's in the book. Okay.
It's in the book, yeah, and he was kind of like, it's quite obvious what you should do with wolves. Boom, 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 boom.
Right.
Like mimed shooting up the whole bar, and I felt like that is an anger that is both about the wolves and also about all these other things.
Many
and
other
I
things.
felt like my own body and our role there. So yeah, it became like there's so many wolf books out there. I can't write another wolf book. I can write a book that's like the most genuine book that I need to write, which is me trying to figure out how to live in the world better.
Oh God, yes. And that's what every one of my favorite books teaches you on some level, right? Whether they intend to or not. So just to respond to that before my next question, which is related. But yeah, I think so I teach in an MFA program, and yet I still have this feeling that I don't want my students to take all of my advice.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's really hard to tell them, you know, and I think that's where critical thinking comes in. It's like, here's everything I'm presenting you with, and yet you're going to have to reject some of it in order to grow. Because I do think, because if you had listened, and the thing is, like, a lot of students will listen if you tell them this is 2 books. They'll listen, and you shouldn't have listened to that. So it is a really complicated thing. And I do think it comes down to that rebellion and that spite. And so you write about fear, but let me also just share with everybody, if you haven't read the book, it's also about bravery book. So I think it's a very important note, that I think OR7 and you're tracking this wolf's path, you also channel some of that, right? So I think it is a book about fear, and I'm sure you went through that period, and I'm sure you felt afraid. But when I read the book, and I'm like really into like badass women writing books, it's like, I just love that. That's what I felt. I wasn't like, oh, this is a fear document. I was like, this makes me feel braver to read, you know. And I felt like it was like a wolf cry, you know what I mean? That like, let's do this a little bit. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I will just say, I think that sometimes like the hot take that's a bad hot take is how I usually learn my like lukewarm take that is my truth, right? Like we triangulate ourselves off of other people's opinions. And I think sometimes like the best thing you can be told is like, define yourself more clearly, or like, you're wrong about this. And then that space, that distance becomes really generative. And so, you know, I don't begrudge that feedback in some way, because she was saying you don't have it yet here and you need to show more.
Which might have pushed you, you know what I mean? Which might have pushed you to be like, no, I'm gonna make this work. And the truth is, like, when you're writing a book this size, that has this much ambition, that covers this much territory, maybe you did have further to go at that point. You know what I mean? Like, that's possible. But the point is, it should have been 1 book, I feel. And it works really well. So my related question, which we've already talked about a little bit today, is this question of, so the way that you end up doing it is this braided approach, right? So you're braiding you're sort of tracking the wolf, and then, you know, tracking the different cultural issues. And then the way that shows up in a craft way is by this braiding and is by this technique. So I'm very curious to know, I guess, like, first of all, the kind of publication story of this. Like, how did you end up at that place? Did the advisor play a role or not? Now I'm curious about this advisor.
All MFA gossip
It's all
here.
let's talk about that. But no, but that process, how did it end up? Because I will just tell you that the way that this is braided is so intricate. Did you have an Excel document? Did you have, like, I know some people have, like, a lot of writers have, like, their murder boards. Like, how did you?
Full murder board, yeah.
I mean, I picture you with a murder board.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm flattered.
It's a compliment. It's a compliment.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that I read the way that maybe many of you do, which is that it's very omnivorously, and I've got the novel by my bed, that's the escapist thing, and I've got the audiobook, and then I've also got, like, the history book and maybe the, like, psychology book, and they're all constantly marinating, right? And I think at a certain point,
yes, that is how I read.
Yeah, and I think, you know, sometimes there's, like, this engine of, like, is this too dilettantish? Should you just be in one? And you silence that, right? Because, like, that association is so generative, and I think understanding, like, if I say the word wolf and I'm so sorry, I'm gonna put you on the spot, Natalie, sorry. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
The boy who cried wolf.
The boy who cried wolf. Okay.
No one's gonna ever come to your events ever again.
I know,
This
is the full, I'm like, ooh, it's a teacher moment.
I thought you were gonna call him a stranger. I was like, that's brave.
I want to call him one more person, but maybe I should stop. But I think, I think that exact thing, where there's, like, this great sweater, it just popped out, you know. There's this ping-ponging of associations that happen, right, when anyone says the word wolf, or as many adults say it, woof, which is just, like, a great embarrassing detail.
They do?
Yeah. And I think I wanted to have a book that where, like, those associations would feel sort of fluid because they're happening all the time in our minds, right? And so I think OR7 is a wolf who we will return to, but left his family around the time that I went to college. And I didn't see him at first as, like, a foil for me. I mean, I'm wary of the, like, my octopus garden, here's this animal and here's me. Like, I didn't want that. That movie's a whole nother conversation. We talk about that later. But
I'd like to hear more about the octopus garden. Yeah.
But I think that sense of, like, there's an animal who is moving away from his family at the same time that I'm moving away from my family. And that became, I think of this book a little bit as, like, there's a ladder that I'm building for the reader, and then there's, like, all of these things that you're grabbing and you're, like, reaching out on a limb and you're, like, learning about werewolves or psychology or the history of fear responses in our bodies or stories, and you have to trust that the ladder is going to be there when you come back, right? And so that became, like, my own chronology a little bit, and then also this wolf story leaving and coming back, and felt like that was important.
Did you have something else you wanted to read about the wolf? To clarify,
Did
you want to still do that?
Yes.
I'm giving you the opening if you want to.
Okay, yeah, we could. Maybe we'll introduce this wolf for those of you that don't
just
know.
So everyone. So I'll just give a little preface before you read it, which is that I just want to start out by saying that I'm not particularly interested in wolves. Like, they're very beautiful, they're very noble. But for me to read this many pages about wolves, you have to understand the way she uses it, right? Which is so interesting. But at the same time, she's tracking this wolf to the extent that it becomes a real character, and where you're really concerned about the welfare of the wolf, and it becomes very suspenseful with the wolf in a way that I did not foresee getting attached to this wolf. So I do want you to just make sure that the audience understands this.
I mean, I think I felt like I wanted to write a wolf book for the me that would not have read a wolf book 5 years ago.
That could be me.
Yeah, So OR7 left his family in northeastern Oregon and quickly became the first state in western Oregon and then California. That's just what you have to know because those areas, like settler colonials, had exterminated wolves in the mid-20th century, basically. So within a week of OR7 crossing into California, the Department of Fish and Wildlife created a Twitter account for him, sharing rough plot points of his journey while hiding his locations. Their wolf OR7, 2-year-old wolf from Oregon, left family to find wife and new home, that's the bio, was joined by fan accounts too, mostly run anonymously, like the wolf OR7 Twitter, Bio, native Oregonian, California tourist, grew up in a troubled family, hobbies, wandering ungulates. And Facebook pages that classified him as a public figure where fans came together to comment things like, he is an amazing symbol of hope and strength, and too cool, what a beaut. By mid-January, the New York Times had published an article about the wolf's almost cult-like status. They quoted a senior policy advisor for the CDFW who said random citizens were suddenly calling the office, quote, saying we should find him a girlfriend as soon as possible and let them settle down. Others wanted to expunge humans from parts of the Golden State and revert the land to wolf sanctuary entirely. Quote, people are going to get wolf tattoos, wolf sweaters, wolf keychains, wolf hats, a board member for a California wolf advocacy organization told the Times. The National Enquirer wrote about OR7. There was a bumper sticker, OR7 for president. The swag made me think of a line about fandom from critic Michelle Orange's memoir. Claiming and being identified with a love of this or that is integral to the pleasure, to the experience of loving it. People wanted to be identified by their love of wolf. That same month, environmental nonprofit Oregon Wild sponsored a naming competition. They wanted to publicize the animal, to make him so famous that nobody would try to kill him, and to promote him as a figurehead for wolf recovery more broadly. Hundreds of children submitted ideas to name him from as far as Finland and Nigeria, and when two girls picked the same name, a 7-year-old from Idaho and an 11-year-old from North Dakota, the name rose in an online poll. Journey. Don't stop believing, read the headlines. So I think, like,
I just felt like you needed to understand the way the wolf is a character in this book.
yeah, and I think it gets a little bit like GoPro Vision with the wolf, where I'm sort of following the wolf, but at the same time, I think one review said you use the wolf as a metaphor. And I was interested in that because I thought, like, it wasn't a bad review, and I don't, if the reviewer is here, thank you so much for saying that. But I think it did make me think that I hope it's not just a metaphor. And I think there's a way that, like, the natural world becomes, there's a fact that can be revelatory. Like, I learned that OR7 in a wildfire traveled towards the wildfire to catch the prey that was fleeing. And that was very poignant to me as someone who didn't know many wolf facts when I went into this. I was like, wolves are so smart, and, like, that's terrifying, right?
I can't imagine you not knowing many wolf facts.
I believe,
Like, it's like 500 pages
of straight wolf
later.
facts.
It's really hard to picture.
No, but I think, like, that was a moment where, like, my poet brain was sort of,
Poet
which was
brain.
my middle school, high school self, was like, that is a metaphor about people moving towards danger because they think they have to do it to stay alive.
But I think your poet brain is still alive and well. I don't think you left it in middle school. I would
Thank you so
say
much.
that this I don't think you could have written this book without a little poet brain.
Yeah.
I would say, just like if we're talking about this craft, that you make some wild associations here,
Mhm.
right? In a way that works.
Mhm.
But in order to make that, to form that kind of associative,
Mhm.
the associations that you make, I think that there is some poetic connections going on here.
Yeah.
And I would also say, I don't know about the metaphor thing. I have to now see this review and, like, get more context.
It's a
But
throwaway line.
I
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
Well, now I want to see the whole thing.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
can talk about it later. But I definitely feel like the wolf provides this motion
Mhm.
through the text. So to be honest, like, I write this kind of stuff too, right? So I'm just saying it can get very bogged down, right? Like, it can get very bogged down with, like, the braiding and the poetry and everything. Not poetry, but, like, this way. But it keeps it moving. And then the other thing is the suspenseful stories. So these moments at which you've been put in danger and the moments at which the wolf is put in danger, and hoping that both of you survive, right? Like, I think, I mean, we know you survived to write the book, but the wolf. So that's important to me that everyone understand, is that it provides this sense of motion that goes beyond just being a metaphor, like a throwaway metaphor.
Totally.
I think.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
And I think, the wolf, OR7 broke all these records. He was amazing, but other wolves also go a really long way. And I think he was wearing a collar so people could track him. And I think that also speaks to the tenor of personal experiences that are in this book. And for a long time, my internal critic was like, you can't write anything approaching memoir because you haven't lived a memoir-worthy life. Which is a bad internal critic. Everyone has these stories, but I also think it speaks to, like, the sort of the beauty of the quotidian shedding light on, like, these larger experiences. And, like, I am putting a GPS collar around my itself and writing about moments that are sort of small, arguably, or mundane, that aren't mundane at all, actually, I would argue. Like the sort of, my old sociology professor said, like, you make the familiar strange. And at one point, another reader of this book said, I think you can take out this bit. It's a pretty normal assault. Which, like, those two words together.
Normal assault is a horrible, that should never be said.
Never be said. And I think, like, that becomes its own engine of, like, what has become normalized and what is deemed too small to write about, right? Or if this ended well, or if this didn't end in violence, it's not a moment. And I think so much of what I was experiencing was, like, a sort of splinter-like quality to my days where, like, you put your hand down and something bad happens and then you're sort of like, well, just move on, and then it happens again and again, and it becomes harder to just be in that space, right? And that was how I felt being in my body or being in the world, and I wanted to sort of like capture that kind of sedimentary quality of risk and risk assessment that we think about.
Yeah. And so then my next question is, so what writers were you reading, or who was particularly inspirational for you when you were thinking about finding the structure for this book? Because I picture you, I mean, and maybe I'm just picturing it how it is for me, but you have all these ideas, you have all these notes, you have all these things, and then you finding the structure, but it can really help to read books that sort of do or sort of model a structure that can be really helpful. So what were who was inspiring you at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I can really, the whole time I was working on the first version of this book in college, I was only reading sort of like serious environmental nonfiction, quote, like, you know, and that was useful. But then I remember, like, right after graduation, I read Leslie Jamison's The Empathy Exams, and I think there's a way that she circles emotion in that book that made me think of this, like, kaleidoscopic prism of experience. And so then, you know, writers like Maggie Nelson or Claudia Rankine, or more recently, like Kathy Park Hong's essays that seem to be about one thing, and then there's just this, like, channel beneath of something else. And I think, you know, the challenge now is people saying, like, what shelf in the bookstore do we put this on? But I really wanted to resist the idea that I had to write for one shelf, you know, and couldn't a story about ecology also be a story about bodies? And you know, in some way I wanted to write to the people that never wanted to read the Wolf book, which becomes like a hard sell when you're like, I'm trying to sell a Wolf book to all the people that don't want to read a Wolf book. And so thank you to my brilliant editorial team and publishers who were, you know, understood, I think, what the book wanted to be, which was not just a book about the wilderness outside, but also very much internal, and this sort of like oscillation that happens.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then I wanted to ask you just the sort of publication history, right? So I'm even trying to think about from what I read and what you represent there. So it was started in college, but then went into the MFA process and program. And then what, right? Because also, like, a lot of people are trying to get their first book deal. And so what was that process like for you, especially with a book like this, which, as you say, it really does fall in a lot of different categories. It's not a clear, like, as you know, just this or just that. Yeah. As we have discussed the entire time. So how did that work in terms of getting an agent, doing this, doing that, this whole process? Because I think sometimes people don't realize how very many steps there are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to shout out my brilliant agent is here.
Yes, I also wanted to facilitate.
Yeah, and we were just talking about this, and I think she always understood to some degree what the book was, and like anyone looking for an agent, just like talking to more people is always the way to go, because I felt like the dosage of different genres in this book, different people had a different idea about what that specific answer was. And ultimately, I think I have a real beachcomber approach to research, which was inspired by being in Minneapolis one day, like zoning out, trying to read at a beach, bad place to read, I can't read at beaches, and there was somebody walking along with a metal detector, and I was like, oh, maybe this person like lost a wedding ring or something. I felt very invested, and then it became clear that she was just looking for anything shiny. And I loved that, because I realized that was my process. And sometimes I knew what I was trying to say and I wanted to prove it. And I think there were moments with this book where I was like, when was the first time that wolves became conflated with masculine violence? I was like, that was a question, and I wanted to trace it through language, and the words like outlaw and wolf there was a conflation in the language in Prussian and Sanskrit and all these things that was interesting. So that was one sort of research. But then there was another form that was just like opening myself to the questions and sort of like wandering through the world and letting those things accrue. And that just takes so long. And I think like could not have happened on a 2-year thing. And I mean, I remember in graduate school going one night that I thought like, I'm just not going to be doing research tonight. I'm going to like take the night off and go to the art museum. And there happened to be a documentary about the militarization of the American police. And while I was sitting in there, supposedly not learning about wolves, there was a reference to these sheepdog seminars where the sort of ideas that, you know, that was being taught to officers was that some people are sheep and they're just like the peace-loving public, and some people are wolves and they will innately be violent, and some people are sheepdogs and they protect. And this is such a clear example of like wolf rhetoric that's harmful to wolves and to people, obviously, and that idea that like a wolf will inherently attack you and should be killed, or that a person would do that. It was like, it really represented another engine of this book, which was like the animalization of people that really troubled me and was very caught up in the wolf rhetoric, and also this like vilification of the animal. But that was an example that became this like big catalyzing moment for how I was thinking about the ways the wolf was alive in American culture today. And I like wouldn't have encountered it if I hadn't just like put my body in front of that screen necessarily. Yeah. So I do think there was a lot of like bumbling built into that process. And then when Flatiron, my wonderful team, is here as well, thank you so much. They were very understanding, and Naji, my editor, understood that the book was going to be kind of capacious and omnivorous, and was just like helped usher that through. And I think that's like the gift, is understanding a little bit what I didn't have a clear comp for what was similar to this book.
That would
and
be
so
a hard thing.
That's a leap of faith on a lot of sides, and yeah.
It really is. So this is the connected question. I told Erica ahead of time, I asked this, not that my students are here, but I asked this for my students because they always ask this question whenever we bring writers to campus, which is, what is your advice for writers who are starting out, for writers who want to do sort of what you've done, for writers who want to publish a book, for writers who want to publish a big, capacious, omnivorous book that is braided, not necessarily about wolves, right? So I asked this question because I know that a lot of young writers really, really love that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of just collecting without knowing where it's going to, and understanding that like sometimes I think that what I'm doing, or what the early phases is, you're like putting these, okay, I don't know the metaphor of like how electricity is made, but I feel like there's something about like, there's a pull, and then there's another pull, and there's static between the pulls, right?
This is the English major. This is like
this
the
is
English
my craft
major
talk
thing.
as an English
This
major.
is the death of the English major by the New Yorker, right here.
2 pulls.
We're like
static
science. There's like a science, something called science.
Yeah, I learned ecology for this book, not electricity. But I do think that sometimes what my goal was just like, you open yourself to things that are shiny and interesting, and then you're allowing a conduit behavior, and also trusting that the reader can get there with you. And I think I did have a lot of questions about the role of my own experience in this book, and I think it was my agent Mariah who at one point said like, your own embodied experience is a form of authority in the way that like an interview with an ecologist is. Like if I'm writing about fear, I can use my own experience the same way that I'd be like, what tools do I have here? Oh, here's a quote from folklore. Here's a quote from this. Oh, here's this thing that I experienced. And I think that was helpful for me to allow that like self-acceptance of like going into some of these things.
Yes.
Yeah.
And oh my God, an agent saying that to you.
She's the best.
I just feel like, wait, what is it? Your embodied experience?
I don't,
quote.
Mariah will correct me. I'm making up this quote now, but yeah, I think that idea that like your embodied experience is a form of authority, and that is true in any category. And I knew that readers would not have the same embodied experience as me, right? So actually that distance became really important, because it was interesting for me to say like, this is the wolf that I'm visualizing. This is my experience with danger. It's going to be different for you, but like, again, that friction is useful. Like you have to read how I interacted on a train to know that you would be much better at separating yourself from someone who sat beside you. And like, why did I have that reaction? Why do you have that reaction? You know, I was interested in like so often it seemed people were talking about like, why do we grow out of fears, or how do we grow out of our fears? And I was feeling kind of swamped by fear at points in this book, but I thought that the way to figure out how to get out of them was to figure out how I'd grown into them. And that was like an unpeeling of many layers.
That makes sense. Okay, so given the outfit and what we talked about before, Little Red Riding Hood. Okay, so if I like to give like a little, so OR7 is a character in the book, right? But so is Little Red Riding Hood for me in a certain way. So how do you see Little Red Riding Hood as functioning in the book? How did you decide how much space to give her this shifting folkloric identity that she occupies? How just talk to me about that, because basically I just want to say that's another place in the book where it just feels like, speaking of feeling capacious, right? Like, and it's a story we all know, so it really works well to go really into it, because we don't all know about OR7, for instance. We learn about that from your book, which is great, but then it's also nice to have the familiar, and I don't know what you said about making the familiar strange, right? So that's certainly, but so let's hear more about how Little Red Riding Hood worked for you. Was she sort of like, I'll let you answer. I like to imagine, but
I think that was the clear folk tale where I realized that like that's where the big bad wolf sort of loomed largest for me, was in that story that I'd inherited sort of from my Western folklore perspective. And at some point realizing that like to free the wolf from that story, the wolf exists off of the sort of like perceived creation of this foolish girl, and understanding that who is a wolf supposed to be chasing determines who the wolf is. And Charles Dickens said that if he could have married Little Red Riding Hood, he would have known perfect bliss. Which is a quote from the book. I know, and it's like you read that and you gotta write about her, right? Because there's a way that
I don't even know what to do with that. I don't even know.
Sorry, I've just ruined Dickens for all of you. But I think it like that story became like a certain form of a creation of a certain kind of adored white American girlhood, I think. And specifically thinking about the ways that she is adored, and that gives her a sense of power, actually. Like the woodsman wants to save her in some versions. But it was interesting to like follow the various versions of this story, and in the very earliest oral storytelling, Little Red Riding Hood escapes, and she does it because she says she has to go pee. Which is like so insane. When I read it, I was like, what? And the wolf is like, do it in the bed. And she says no. And she goes outside and he ties a string around her, and she ties it around a tree instead. And he pulls the string to bring her back, and it's just the tree. And she's run home. And the wolf follows her, but she's already gone. And that was a story that would have been told between women in these sort of like early Middle Ages when things were really rough. And it was existed as a fairy tale to sort of like create resilience and uplifting, right? Yeah. And then it sort of got smoothed out in this sort of like bourgeoisie portrait that was trying to create this conflation of girl and victim. That really troubled me. And I think at certain points I felt like I can't change maybe this patriarchal world that I'm growing up in, or trying to think about how to help raise other young women in, but I can maybe like change these stories in my head. And so much of Little Red Riding Hood is a story about what you think will happen to your body when you're in the woods, or what you think, what stories you believe are waiting for you. And it felt like that was a story that, to excavate the wolf from that, I could also sort of like excavate the creation of my own self from that.
Yeah, and just that idea of like, if you tell the wolf you need to go to the bathroom, like you're saying, like the past among women and past among people of like how to survive the wolf. Yeah. Right? Like try to get away from the person. So it's an interesting way of seeing it. So we have Little Red Riding Hood, and then there's also Crying Wolf, and the little boy who cried wolf. What exactly is it? And it was originally going to be called Cry Wolf, right? Yeah. Is that right? Because I feel like I saw an early announcement. And it was like that was the title. Yeah. Okay, but so then you and I have talked about this question of writers being liars.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes up in the book too.
Yeah.
Not so much like liars, but like maybe especially earlier in life,
Yeah.
but before they learn to kind of rein it in when the other kids are like, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like an early version of writing.
Mm-hmm.
But so and we talked about like how probably a lot of writers have this experience.
I
We're
love
gonna
that you
call them-
immediately identified with this. I felt very seen.
Yeah, I was like, I was such a liar as a child. It was like insane. But I think I was starting to write. Like, I think I was actually writing, but I just hadn't. Then I was like, oh, I put it on paper and I tell the truth in life. I'm like, okay. But yeah, what about Crying Wolf and the little boy who cried, the big boy, whoever, whatever the boy was, how did that all come together for you and function in the book? This question of lying, this question of the unreliable narrator. At times you'll say, at one point in the book you say something along the lines of like, it's up to you whether you believe me or not about this, right? So there, you're kind of playing on the unreliable narrator, you're looking at this folklore, and then you're also looking at this sort of like writerly quality, and how do all those threads, or how do they all come together for you or sort of function?
I mean, I think understanding that the trope of the boy who cried wolf is in some ways, there is a tie to Little Red Riding Hood where, who is believed about the threat, right? There's very easily to imagine a version of Little Red Riding Hood where she's like, I met a wolf in the forest. And they're like, no, you didn't. She's like, no, I'm not okay. And there would not be belief, right?
Yeah.
And so understanding that, I mean, I think about like early research I did into werewolf stories and how very often some of these stories that were like, I met a creature in the woods that was a werewolf, and that became a way in some of these more traditional societies to say like other things that were otherwise unsaid, right? A miscarriage, sexual assault, pedophilia. Like there's oral historian was sort of tracking these werewolf stories and finding that like that became a way of saying like I survived, I met a thing and I survived. And so I think like many of these wolf stories, there is like this nesting in of narrative and survival sort of like baked into them.
Yes.
And I think any writer, as soon as you put the memory on the page, it becomes true. And only later, I mean, the benefit of writing this book over 10 years was I wrote a scene that was in my college thesis that was about seeing wolves in Yellowstone. And I thought that they'd eaten that a mother bison had like had to abandon her baby and the wolves had come to eat the baby.
Yeah, I
And
remember
it really moved me. I was really horrified by this scene. And only later working on this revision, and I was like, I should like call my grandma, call my sister, do some interviews, do my due diligence. They were like, there's no way that happened. Like you just made up the wolves. And that was shocking to me, writing a book about what we do.
But not
with wolves.
shocking to me, as I was a child liar.
Yeah. I can just see like child liar, great blurb on my
I was
book.
like, I saw so many wolves, and everyone's like, no, you definitely didn't, because
Yeah.
you're a liar.
I mean, I think like the wolf is that we hear it before we see it, exists sort of spectrally, and I think that's part of that fascination with it.
Yeah.
And that's true for so many stories. I think like trying to narrate like the scene I read aloud earlier, just a real failure of like knowing how to narrate, even to say, did they mean harm? My friend who's a prosecutor called me and was like, of course they meant harm. I was like, you're right, of course, and like you're still reliving these moments and thinking like, what is the truth of them? I don't know that a book becomes an object of how we approach a certain form of thing, but like it's still, there's a generation there. Yeah.
Yeah, and just that question of like trauma. Oh,
I hate to cut you off, but I just want to make sure we have time for some audience questions.
I'm just running out of questions, and I was like, what can I ask her? Something else about her jumpsuit. I was a child liar. It's perfect. Did you want to say any last things before we move into
Let's
the
just
Q&A?
launch into Q&A, see what happens.
I can generate some more just in case if needed.
Should
Am
I
I?
call?
Oh, I don't know.
I saw
Okay.
Eddie's hand first. Sorry, I know you.
I'm curious about the twin arcs of the period of fear in your 20s and the process of working on the book, and whether you think the fear would have happened without the book, what has finishing the book done for the fear, or if they just sort of moved in different directions.
Yeah, I mean, I had a therapist around the time I was starting the book who was like, oh, you're writing about your fear, you're going to therapy about your fear. I think you're like fixating on the fear. You should maybe stop the writing.
Also bad advice.
Also bad advice. And not to be like, I'm a big rebel, I'm really good at ignoring advice. I'm like the most, I take a lot of advice that I shouldn't.
So do I, but that's why I think you have to be careful with bad advice.
Yeah.
Because I take advice.
I mean, I think at that point I was like, I obviously have to write through this to some degree. And I think I became interested in the symbolic wolves around the same time I became interested in the real wolves. And there was a little bit of a like, narratively, I wanted to, I was trying to figure out that relationship between them. And I don't think that I'm not as afraid now as I was earlier. And I think one of those things has been studying fear in myself as an animal, like understanding that I'm an animal having fear responses. And I talked to one woman who is a biologist who studies the ecology of fear and these ideas that there's like these psychological topographies in our mind where we evaluate threat and risk. And that happens on the street, that happens in a room like this. And like an animal, when its head is down to eat, it's more in danger. And I think I started mapping that in my own life and thinking that it was actually like very useful to think about fear in animal contexts in my own. And in a weird way, there was some like palliative thing in that. And I think she was like, fear is not an emotion in my lab. It's a set of behaviors. And like there's these dominoes that tip after something scary happens and your body has to remember. And that was really helpful for me because I think there's a French phrase, entre chien et loup, like between a dog and a wolf, that I became really fixated on in this book, which seemed to me like, how do we evaluate if we're right to be afraid? And I think that was the question that like I set off with this book, being like, I will get better at knowing whether I'm right to be panicked on this train right now. And actually where I'm at now is just learning to better sit beside the uncertainty of like what we can't control. And I think that's like growing up in a nutshell is like learning to sort of sit beside our fears, walk beside them, and also understand that like fear is sold to us and fear is usually benefiting someone and it's harming someone, and being able to like question it and not just like inherit it. So I think it's worked for me. And the therapist is fully wrong. I wrote myself out of it.
I am curious about the darlings you killed. And I would love to hear, like, just like, I'm sure there are many, but one that you would particularly like to talk about, whether it's like a thread that you didn't explore in the book, or an anecdote, or an interview, or a subject that was like really compelling.
Yeah, I love that. I interviewed someone whose full job was driving around in a truck, drinking Mountain Dew, scaring wolves with firecrackers. And just like, I was obsessed. I wanted to write about it so much because...
But who was paying them to do that?
The government.
Oh. Are you sure?
And this is like in this whole, I mean, this is not a book that tells people how we should, it's not like a policy prescription for living beside real wolves, but I do think I was trying to figure out like, what does it look like to like be a rancher trying to protect your herd and also having wolves? And one of the things was like, well, we'll pay these people like a range rider kind of to help when we get the GPS caller saying there's a wolf nearby, he's like gonna go out and throw fireworks at them while like eating his ham sandwich. And those were direct. I mean, I asked him, I was like, what were you eating? What were you listening to on the radio? And he was so patient with me, and I just loved this conversation, and I didn't have a place for it in the book. And it felt poignant to me because wolves are very fearful, and like, you know, I don't know, that was just one of those things. But I do think even now, I was recently doing an interview for the local TV station in Portland, so I'm like very sweaty in front of the green screen. And the woman, it's like counting down, like, we're live in 30, right? And she's like, have you heard that one story about the woman who killed her children while playing Duran Duran's Howling Like a Wolf? And I was like, no, how have I not heard this story? And then it's like, 15 seconds, you are live. And I was like, and she said that this woman blamed
Was it her?
She killed them. Oh, no, not the host. She admits it right there on screen.
Like, this is a great story. I would have to, on air, then it's like 29, 28. And she's like, it was me.
The mother said that a crazy man had come out of the woods and killed them. And that to me, like, is an example. This was like a very late darling, but immediately my brain took off. And like, this is so much what the book is about, which is like, not being able to accept or identify the violence or danger in ourselves or in our own species or in our own community. And so we make it other, right? We make it wolf, we make it scary man. And so I immediately was like, I wish I had written about that, even though it's a terrible, terrible story. So
I'm gonna have to Google that and find
her
out.
name's Debbie.
Okay.
Yeah,
But it wasn't the host.
wasn't the host. Yeah.
One more question. I loved what you said about like gathering material being sort of like metal detecting, and I was wondering if there was an illuminating anecdote for you that brought together the wolf and the fear that kind of helped you realize this project, or if it was like a more subtle vibration between those two things throughout the process.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. I do think it was. At one point, I started writing down all the idioms I could find about wolves because it seemed to me that all these wolf stories were just about parents trying to teach their children how to stay alive, or like how to be wise or how to be brave. And I'm not a parent, but I've like had mentored, and I don't know, I like a innate caretaker vibes, big sister energy.
I feel them tonight. I feel cared for.
But also just like worrying for myself, you know, and I think I became interested in like if the stories that we're going to tell someone to stay alive are not like stay off the path, don't talk to the wolf, like what are those other stories? And I think that this phrase entre chien et loup, which I heard at an artist residency, like after dinner, a woman who was French was like, have you heard this phrase? And it actually cast the whole book. It's in the first paragraph of my proposal, because I felt like that was a phrase that was all about identifying the fear, and also if the thing coming towards you, if you can't tell if it's a dog or a wolf, that's not a totally bad feeling. Like there's some excitement there and there's some intrigue there. And I think that captured so much of our relationship with fear, which is there's both dread is a form of like fantasy making, right? And like worrying is a form of like creating a future. And I was interested in the ways that I had become maybe addicted to my fear, in the way I think Marilyn Robinson has a great quote about like fear as an addiction, and then you have to like acknowledge the sort of thrill of it. So that was a quote that for me like gelled something.
I think that's all
Thank
the time
you.
we have. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and thank you all for asking such wonderful questions. Thank you, Erica, for talking about this book with us, and Caroline, of course, for moderating such a fantastic discussion. So, as I said earlier, Erica will be signing and personalizing books. My coworker Jenny in the back is going to point right now to where that is, because it's a little bit hidden.
Okay.
So we're going to have you all kind of line up down the center aisle and curve around. Of course, we have plenty of additional copies available for purchase, as well as Caroline's book, Weird Girls.
Highly recommend.
Yeah, great little duo going on here. Companion read, if you will. That's
Childhood liars.
all great. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can get a copy of Wolfish by clicking the link in the description. All right, thank you all so much for coming out. Let's give these two one last round of applause.